Today, the New Orleans Police Department arrested Hilda Vasquez, the mother of 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez, in connection with his investigation into his death.
A stunning turn in the case of 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez, the boy who disappeared out in New Orleans. His own mother, Hilda Vasquez, is now under arrest, facing serious charges in the latest chapter of a story that raised tough questions for police and child welfare agencies. We are going to break down this latest development with a criminal defense attorney who has insight into a disturbing detail that could turn this case on its head. Allegations that this wasn't Vasquez's first encounter with abuse. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. There has been a major development in a case that has gripped New Orleans for weeks. The mother of a 12-year-old boy who vanished last month, only to be found dead in a lagoon, has now been arrested and brought before a judge. She is facing serious charges. Now, to understand how we got here, you got to go back to the very beginning of this story, this very, very sad story. It all started on the morning of August 14, 2025, when 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez disappeared from his home. Now, this was in the village of De La Est neighborhood of New Orleans. Bryan was, it's important to note, nonverbal, neurodivergent, especially vulnerable. His family said that he had been last seen inside his sister's bedroom, but by late that morning, he was gone. His last known sighting was on this neighbor's doorbell footage, apparently wearing only a diaper, wandering alone on the street, unattended. And what followed was an agonizing 12-day search that saw neighbors and volunteers, even the Cajun Navy, combing the area with sonar drones and airboats. And police, too, they mobilized. In fact, this was such a big case. I just was in CrimeCon, and I was talking to numerous people about this situation, because what happened? It came out that there had been a 5-hour gap between when Bryan's mother reported him missing and when the police, NOPD, began actively searching. That's the allegation. At a press conference, Police Superintendent Ann Kirkpatrick admitted the delay was inordinate and confirmed that Internal Affairs was opening an investigation into what went wrong. And then, August 26th, that's when everything changed. That is when the worst news imaginable came forward. Search teams located some of Bryan's remains in a lagoon not far from his home. Days later, the Orleans Parish coroner ruled that Bryan had died from blunt force trauma caused by an alligator and from drowning. According to reporting from NOLA.com, hunters set out alligator traps at the lagoon, and the coroner's office told the outlet that one of those gators trapped was dissected, revealing what has been called the upper remains of a human. DNA testing is going to confirm whether the remains actually belong to Bryan. It's horrific. It's horrific. The investigation into how we got into this point took a very sharp turn inward, though, toward Bryan's own household, because it started when authorities issued a search warrant for cell phones they say belonged to Vasquez's family. And it has now ended with the arrest of Bryan's mother, Hilda Vasquez. She is now facing charges of negligent homicide and cruelty to juveniles. Police say she gave a series of conflicting statements, all of which have now been revealed in a newly released arrest warrant. Now, I'm going to break all of that down in a minute, but first, I want to bring on a guest. I want to bring on criminal defense attorney Eric Faddis, who's going to go through this with me. Eric, it's so good to see you. Let's start here. How serious are these charges? And also in terms of potential sentencing. Obviously, they're serious, but how serious are they in terms of what a potential sentence could be? What are we talking about here?
Sure, Jesse. So anytime you have a homicide charge, I mean, that's the most serious category of a criminal offense. So some grave allegations here. In terms of potential sentence, the Louisiana Code talks about what the penalties could be. My understanding is that it's at least up to 10 years in prison for conviction for this type of offense.
When we talk negligent homicide, for our viewers, how is that different from, let's say, second-degree murder? How is that different from manslaughter? What exactly do they need to prove for negligent homicide? What is that theory?
Yeah, so negligent homicide is different than negligence in like a car accident case where you rear-end somebody. Criminally negligent homicide requires a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable parent would have exercised under like circumstances. It's arguably a lesser burden than like first-degree murder, which is intentionally killing somebody, or a lesser offense of recklessly killing somebody. Criminally negligent homicide falls somewhere below that.
And this cruelty to juveniles, right? Is that a standalone charge? Is that, hey, if we can't prove negligent homicide, At least we can try to get her convicted of this.
Yeah, that's a lesser offense. I think arguably it does require less evidence to prove. It talks about criminally negligent mistreatment or neglect that results in serious bodily injury. Here, the alleged victim is deceased, so the serious bodily injury piece is met. All that's remaining is whether this was criminally negligent mistreatment or neglect for that charge.
Now, here on Sidebar, we talk a lot about emergencies, right? But what we don't talk about enough is how to prepare so you can face anything with confidence. I mean, did you know that falls are one of the leading causes of injury for older Americans? Yeah, 1 in 4 experiences one each year. And getting help fast, that can make all the difference. That is where Medical Guardian comes in. And if you think you already know what a medical alert device is like, think again. Medical Guardian continues to innovate, making them sleeker, easier to use, faster than anything you may have seen before. They offer devices that you can wear your way, around your neck, on your wrist, clipped to your belt, so protection fits seamlessly into your daily life. These devices, they work nationwide with 4G LTE and Wi-Fi, connecting you instantly to 24/7 US-based emergency operators who already know your name, where you are, who to call. They can send emergency services and notify your loved ones. So whether it's a fall, a sudden allergic reaction, a car accident, any medical emergency. And with optional fall detection, they can even call for help automatically if you can't press the button yourself. So right now, Medical Guardian is offering our viewers an exclusive 75% off of their top-rated MG Mini and MG Mini Lite. Because being prepared, it's not about fear, it's about living your life without limits. Knowing help is always within reach. So, visit medicalguardian.com/sidebar75, use code sidebar75 or DDS75 today to claim your 75% off. Again, this is a tragedy. This shouldn't have happened. I think we can all agree. Why did this happen? But when you have the coroner ruling that Bryan's death involved both blunt force trauma from an alligator and drowning, at least that's my understanding, how are prosecutors going to link the mother's alleged negligence or cruelty to children directly to the cause of death? Is that what they're doing? Explain that to me. Is that going to be tough?
Yeah, Jesse. So the prosecutors have to draw a causal link between the mother's actions or omissions and ultimately Bryan's demise. And so how are they going to do that? They're going to talk about this alleged criminal negligence, the fact that she was being a neglectful mother. She was not being observant. She was not exercising the right supervision. And that resulted in Bryan leaving the home. Now, they're going to have a difficult time because there is sort of an intervening event here with the alligator. And the defense is going to say alligator caused the death, not the mom.
But I guess it's the idea is if you didn't do enough to watch your child and they get hit by a car, they get, what we're talking about here. If they fall down, it's like you have a responsibility. I guess the question is, and this is something we're going to explore, what is the legal line between arguably bad parenting and a crime?
So typically in this case, they're going to have to prove that the mother's actions or omissions were a substantial factor in causing what happened. We have regular neglect, right? You look away from your child for too long and they, run into a table and hurt themselves. That's regular negligence. We're talking about criminal negligence, a gross deviation from the standard of care. And that's where the prosecution is going to bring in this alleged pattern of neglect, this alleged pattern of abusive conduct, which sort of ultimately escalated to this horrible set of circumstances we're discussing today.
Could the defense in any way work with the idea, raising questions about whether law enforcement mishandled the case? Wasn't there like a 5-hour delay in the police response? Is that something the defense could work with?
Oh, I think absolutely, Jesse. My understanding is that the child was reported missing, and then police did not respond for about 5 hours after that. Gosh, had there been a more timely response, maybe they would have found this kid. This was a 12-year-old sort of wandering around. There had been reports of him, and he's actually on video at one point walking around a neighborhood. He could have been found, and all of this could have been prevented had the police responded in a more prompt fashion. I think defense is going to argue that the police's neglect, alleged neglect, contributed to what happened and could have prevented all of this had there been a different response.
So I want to get into the details of this arrest warrant right now. Now, according to that warrant that was reviewed by WWL TV, Hilda Vasquez gave a series of statements that detectives described as conflicting. In one 911 call that was placed at around 10:20 a.m. on August 14th, Vasquez allegedly told the dispatcher, "I do not know when he escaped, but I am just now finding out." So the warrant reveals that Hilda said she gave Bryan a sleep aid medication at 8 p.m. on August 13th. Then she woke up at around 3 a.m. to care for her newborn, found Bryan in the kitchen, and she said it was common for Bryan to wake up during the night, and she guided him to his sister's room to go back to sleep. She allegedly admitted that later, at around 7:50 a.m., she took her other 6-year-old son to school, didn't check on Bryan. She added, quote, "I've been checking on him, but today I don't know when he escaped." Now, police noted that the bedroom window was open, to which Vasquez claimed she had only just become aware of that during the 911 call. When the dispatcher asked her how Bryan left, Vasquez reportedly replied, "He just opens the door and leaves." And from there, according to WVUE, investigators say Vasquez told them of 2 separate incidents where Bryan had run away. Now, we'll get to those, but first, Bryan, could these apparent differences in her timeline or explanations, is this confusion? Is this stress of the situation? Is this trauma? Or is this evidence of a crime?
Well, it depends on who you ask. Certainly the government, like you said, is characterizing it as inconsistent statements that could sort of impugn Hilda's credibility in front of the jury. On the other hand, I mean, this was a very chaotic scenario, quickly developing. My understanding is Hilda was trying to report the child missing. Her team is going to say, hey, she was doing the best she could under the circumstances to relay the information she had as she was learning it and as she was learning new information. And so I'm not sure those statements are going to be overly problematic for the defense.
The best she could. Is this apparent lapse in supervision? If we take these statements, right, looking at checking on Bryan at 3 a.m., then leaves to take another child to school, doesn't check on him, is that a crime? Is that negligence? Is that criminally negligent homicide?
That's why we have jury trials, Jesse. That's what the jury's ultimately going to have to decide. And I think it's a close call here. We're talking about what a reasonable parent would do under similar circumstances. We got to keep in mind that Bryan, the child, was nonverbal. He was allegedly on the autism spectrum. And so he was a special needs kid. And so what would a reasonable parent of a special needs kid do? And did Hilda's behavior constitute a gross deviation from that? That's what the jury is going to have to determine. And like I said, I think it's a close call.
And investigators say she told them Bryan had run away before. How does that impact the analysis?
So that's going to go to Hilda's state of mind when all of this transpired. The government's going to argue, hey, look, this wasn't a one-off scenario where Bryan happened to get out unbeknownst to the mom for the first time. Apparently, this had happened twice, and allegedly it happened in very proximal time to when Bryan ultimately left and died. And so the prosecution is going to say, hey, that's gross deviation from the standard of care. She should have known that this kid had a propensity for leaving and going out there unsupervised, and she did not take reasonable measures to prevent harm from happening to that kid with the knowledge that he has a predilection to do this.
We talk about in the law, particularly with negligence, foreseeability, right? You should have known, you should have foreseen the consequences, you should have foreseen the danger. Keeping the window, if it was open, when did you notice it open? Was she under a duty to keep the window locked? I mean, was it foreseeable that he could potentially have left that way?
I think it was foreseeable that he could have left through the window. Whether she had a legal duty to keep it locked is a different question entirely. And, there's no law that essentially says, hey, if your kid gets out of the house one time, you got to make sure all the windows are locked. However, it's a consideration that the jury might factor into their analysis when deciding, hey, what reasonable measures could this mother have done to try to prevent this with the knowledge she had of how her kid behaves? And it's reasonable to think that she could have put locks on those windows, but didn't, and now here we are.
Let's go back to this. So according to reporting from WVUE, who reviewed this arrest warrant in this case, Hilda Vasquez told police that at her previous home on August 1st, officers found Bryan naked, drinking water from a drainage ditch. 3 days later, she said a neighbor found him wandering, returned him to her home, and that second incident, police say, was never reported. So once Bryan's body was recovered, detectives, they dug into DCFS, right? Department of Child and Family Services, their records, and uncovered just even more troubling findings. Court filings outlined that when Bryan was just 3 months old, he was hospitalized with a fractured skull, brain swelling, broken legs, retinal hemorrhages, and punctured lungs, injuries described as non-accidental. Now, Vasquez was actually arrested then, convicted on account of cruelty to juveniles, and she later pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. There were more reports over the years, though. In 2022, DCFS investigated again after Vasquez allegedly left Bryan and his siblings unsupervised. And that same report noted scratches on Bryan's body. Detectives wrote in the warrant, as the investigation progressed, it began to emerge that there were confirmed signs of child criminal neglect. As a result of Vasquez's failure to protect and check on Bryan, he sustained serious bodily harm after he left the residence and entered the water. Eric, how does that affect her current case?
Surely the prosecution is going to talk about an alleged pattern of neglect here, a pattern of a lack of supervision.
And by the way, will it come in? Would a judge allow that to come in?
Yeah, that's an important question, Jesse, because I think the incident that happened when the child was 3 months old, that is so remote in time. That was approximately 12 years ago. I think a judge is going to say, hey, that's too inflammatory, it's too prejudicial, and it's not related enough to what happened. However, the 2022 incident, I think, is a problem for the defense, because what it shows is that when she lacks supervision of this kid, he goes out and gets hurt. And that is exactly the set of circumstances that happened in 2025, which ultimately led to that child's death.
Yeah, and that's the part, right? If it is allowed in, doesn't it make it incredibly hard for a defense attorney to argue that this was just a totally tragic, unforeseen accident? She played no role in it whatsoever, if the judge allows this in.
It certainly does. I think one argument the defense might make is that, hey, parenting is hard, and parenting a special needs kid is hard. And every parent has likely left their child unsupervised for some period of time throughout that kid's life, and that kid got some kind of injury, whether minor or otherwise. And so, does that lack of attention to that kid temporarily constitute a gross deviation? It might constitute negligence, but does it constitute criminal negligence, which is a gross deviation from what a reasonable parent would do? That's really the crux of it, and that's going to depend in part on how the jury sees what reasonable parenting is.
What role does DCFS play in a criminal investigation or prosecution like this? I'm not trying to cast stones, but if there is determined to be a failure by the child welfare system to step in earlier, if they knew of the risks, didn't do more, and I know they're limited. We talk about it all the time, what they are limited to do. And we know that there is always a goal to maintain the family unit. But how is that something that maybe the defense could work with?
I'm not sure how helpful it might be for the defense, because how would the argument go? Would it go something like Child Protective Services didn't secure this kid well enough from this horribly negligent mother who ultimately lacked supervision and resulted in the kid getting hurt again?
I guess the argument would be it was a really unfortunate series of events, but clearly they didn't think a crime was being committed, right? Or they didn't think that it was rising to the level of the child needing to be taken away. This was just an overwhelmed mother. I don't know.
Sure. I think that's a fair point. And I think defense can style that as, hey, look, if there was a serious pattern of neglect that was putting this child at risk, why in the world would the agency responsible for making that decision give the child back? The reason they gave the child back is because they didn't observe something overly alarming, some gross deviation from a standard of care of reasonable parenting. They didn't see that, and they're the experts on keeping children safe from parents. They gave the kid back because they thought the kid was safe.
And by the way, I'm not defending her in any way. I'm just trying to make some legal arguments and try to understand where they're going to go. So let's now talk about this. So on September 7th, NOPD announced that Vasquez had been arrested and booked into the Orleans Justice Center at a press conference. Take a look.
Today, the New Orleans Police Department arrested Hilda Vasquez, the mother of 12-year-old Bryan Vasquez, in connection with his investigation into his death. Ms. Vasquez was taken into custody today, Sunday, September 7th, and has been charged with second-degree cruelty to a juvenile, and negligent homicide. This was an emotional and really traumatic case, not just for the community, the family, but also our own officers and every officer that was out there. It was not an easy time for anyone, and we're, again, We wish the outcome would have been different, but it's not the case. But we have to pursue and seek justice for Bryan.
This is important to note. Department leaders, they described her actions not as this isolated mistake, but as part of a long pattern.
This has all been a pattern of behavior by the mother. This is not the first time that Bryan has been the victim of any sort of trauma and or anything that we deem to be negligent. So this is all pattern, and this is all established in the warrant.
There has been a pattern of both negligence and abuse over Bryan's 12 years. And so we believe that we can prove that that pattern of negligence and abuse led to a severe injury or undue pain and suffering on his part.
They also addressed DCFS, their involvement, whether Bryan had ever been removed from his mother's care.
We know that when Ms. Vasquez was arrested and convicted for abusing Bryan, when he was 3 months old, she committed a skull fracture, broken legs, and a collapsed lung. At that point, he was removed from the home. And then at some point subsequent to that, DCFS returned him back to the home. And that's obviously part of the information that we're working with our DCF partners. But that's in the public realm. That's in our our arrest warrant application that she had that previous conviction, and there was a period when he was removed from the home.
Reporters, they pressed police on the family's past, and police confirmed that after Vasquez was convicted of abuse when Bryan was an infant, he was indeed removed from her custody, but was later returned by DCFS. And when asked why, officials deferred to the agency, saying those records would be part of the court case. Now, Vasquez, she appeared briefly in criminal district court on September 8th. She was scheduled for an arraignment, but that portion of the hearing was postponed so she could actually secure an attorney. In the meantime, the judge imposed very strict protective orders. No contact whatsoever with her children, not even a phone call. If she posts bail, she has to remain at least 600 feet away from them and complete a domestic abuse program by late December. Eric, let's actually start right there. Those conditions, those really strict protective orders, are those conditions in these kinds of cases common?
Yes, I think they're common and certainly tough, but arguably fair. What the court wants to do is that they need to protect the other children. They also need to make sure that there is no sort of witness tampering that could happen, that the mother could be communicating with the children and trying to sort of create some narrative that is false. So they're trying to protect against that. They're trying to also make sure that if this mother bombs out, she has at least some tools, some resources that will sort of empower her to keep the children safe during the pendency of this case. So I think those conditions are really important.
That statement about explaining the history and how the child was removed, child was brought back, talk to the agency about why the rationale behind that, it will be part of the court case. What did you take away from that?
I think that in these child cases, there are a lot of moving parts. You have the police aspect, you have child services, and you have the courts and everything else. And so I think that what that could be referencing is there are records with respect to child protective services. There are documentations of incidents of corrective actions of the mother's statements. And all of those things could factor in to what happened in this instant case and be used against the defendant at some point, although I bet defense will file motions trying to exclude child protective services information or substantially limit it.
Eric Faddis, this is a very, very sad case. Weeks after Bryan's disappearance that shook this city, his mother is now stand accused of these really heinous crimes. She is due back in court on September 12th to confirm that she has legal representation. A bail hearing is scheduled for Monday, September 5th. We shall see what happens. Eric Faddis, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram, X. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll see you next time.